Parliament just witnessed the most explosive confrontation in modern British political history. Nigel Farage stood up in the House of Commons and delivered a speech so devastating, so brutally accurate, so impossible to refute, that Labour MPs literally walked out of the chamber rather than sit there and listen to the truth being spoken directly to their faces. This wasn't a normal parliamentary exchange where politicians trade rehearsed barbs and scripted comebacks. This was an absolute demolition of Keir Starmer and his entire government, delivered with surgical precision and backed by facts that nobody could dispute. The atmosphere in the Commons was electric, with tension from the moment Farage rose to speak, because everyone knew something significant was about to happen. You could see it in how Starmer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, how Labour frontbenchers suddenly found their papers incredibly interesting, how the chamber went quiet in a way that only happens when people sense they're about to witness something historic. And Farage did not disappoint. For 23 minutes, he systematically dismantled every claim Starmer has made, every promise the government has broken, every lie they've told the British people. He brought documents, he cited specific examples, he named names and provided dates and figures that couldn't be explained away or spun into something less damaging. The Labour benches tried to shout him down at first, but as he continued speaking, as the evidence piled up and the contradictions became impossible to ignore, their protests grew weaker and eventually stopped altogether. Some MPs sat with their heads in their hands, others stared straight ahead with expressions that looked like they wished they were anywhere else. And then, in a moment that will be replayed for decades, a group of Labour MPs actually stood up and walked out of the chamber while Farage was still speaking. They stormed out in disgrace because they couldn't handle hearing the truth about what their party has become and what their leader has done to Britain. The Speaker didn't stop them. The remaining MPs watched them go in stunned silence, and Farage just kept speaking, his voice calm and measured, making his points with devastating effectiveness while his opponents literally fled rather than face the reality he was presenting. The confrontation had been building for weeks, ever since Farage returned to Parliament with a mandate from voters who were desperate for someone to actually represent their interests and hold the government accountable. His presence in the Commons had been a thorn in Starmer's side from day one, because Farage doesn't play by the usual rules of polite political theatre, where everyone pretends to disagree while actually protecting the system that benefits them all. Farage came to Parliament to fight, to challenge, to speak uncomfortable truths that the establishment would prefer remain unspoken. And he'd been doing exactly that in every session, asking questions that Starmer couldn't answer, raising issues that exposed the government's incompetence and dishonesty, refusing to accept the kind of non-answer answers that most MPs let slide. The tension between them had been escalating with each passing week, with Starmer becoming visibly more irritated every time Farage stood to speak, and with Farage becoming increasingly bold in his criticisms as he realised just how much ammunition the government was giving him. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a routine debate about government policy. Starmer had given a speech laying out his vision for Britain's future, full of the usual optimistic rhetoric about investment and growth and opportunity. It was the kind of speech that sounds good if you don't think too hard about whether any of it is actually true or achievable. Most MPs would have offered token opposition and then moved on to other business, but Farage had been waiting for exactly this moment, and he'd come prepared with everything he needed to expose the massive gap between Starmer's words and reality. When Farage was called to speak, he started quietly, almost conversationally, thanking the Prime Minister for his speech and noting how inspiring it sounded on the surface. The sarcasm was subtle but unmistakable. He said that listening to Starmer describe Britain's bright future reminded him of listening to other politicians throughout history who had made grand promises while presiding over decline and failure. He paused to let that comparison sink in. And you could see Labour MPs starting to get agitated, knowing that something uncomfortable was coming, but not yet sure how bad it would be. Farage then pulled out a folder full of documents and said he wanted to talk about the reality of what was actually happening in Britain under Starmer's leadership, as opposed to the fantasy version that had just been presented to the House. He started with the economy, methodically going through government statistics that showed declining growth, falling investment, rising unemployment in key sectors, and capital flight as businesses relocated to more favourable environments. For each statistic, he provided the source, the date, and the context, making it impossible to dismiss his claims as made up or taken out of context. He pointed out that these weren't opposition talking points or biased interpretations. These were the government's own numbers, and they told a story of economic decline that contradicted everything Starmer had just said about growth and prosperity. Labour MPs tried to interrupt with points of order and challenges, but the Speaker allowed Farage to continue because he was speaking to the substance of the debate and backing up his claims with evidence. The frustration on the Labour benches was visible and growing. Farage moved from economics to the issue of government transparency and accountability, and this is where his speech became truly devastating. He brought up the consultant spending that had been raised during PMQS, the issue that had led to Starmer's meltdown and public reprimand by the Speaker. But Farage didn't just mention it in passing. He'd done extensive research into exactly where that money was going. He named specific consulting firms that had received contracts worth tens of millions of pounds. He described what those contracts were supposedly for and then detailed how little actual value they'd delivered. He showed that in many cases, the same firms kept getting renewed contracts despite failing to meet basic deliverables or success metrics. And then he revealed the connections between these firms and Labour Party officials, showing a pattern of what looked very much like corruption or at minimum cronyism on a massive scale. The specificity was damning. These weren't vague allegations. These were documented relationships and financial transactions that anyone could verify. He displayed charts showing the flow of money from government contracts to consulting firms, and then tracking how people from those same firms ended up in government positions or how government officials ended up working for those firms after leaving office. The revolving door between Starmer's government and the companies benefiting from government spending was laid bare for everyone to see. Labour MPs were shouting now, trying to drown him out, but Farage's microphone was on, and their protests only made them look more desperate and guilty. Then Farage did something that elevated his speech from harsh criticism to complete destruction. He started reading direct quotes from Starmer's campaign speeches and manifestos, promises about transparency and integrity and putting the public interest first. He read these quotes in Starmer's own words, letting them hang in the air, and then he contrasted each promise with specific examples of how Starmer's government had done the exact opposite. Promise of transparency, followed by evidence of unprecedented secrecy and stonewalling of legitimate inquiries. Promise of integrity, followed by examples of the cronyism and conflicts of interest he'd just documented. Promise of putting people first, followed by statistics showing declining public services, while spending on consultants soared. The contrast was absolutely brutal, and it was all presented in Starmer's own words, making it impossible for him or his supporters to claim this was unfair characterisation. These were his promises, and this was his record, and the gap between them was enormous and indefensible. You could see Starmer's expression darkening as Farage spoke. See him conferring urgently with advisors sitting behind him. See him looking for some way to respond or interrupt or stop what was happening. But there was nothing he could do. Farage had the floor. He was following all parliamentary rules, and everything he was saying was documented and verifiable. The Labour benches had gone from angry shouting to an uncomfortable near silence as they realised just how comprehensively their leader was being exposed. Some MPs were checking their phones, probably looking up the information Farage was citing to see if it was accurate, and discovering to their horror that it was. Others just sat there looking shell-shocked, realising that the version of events they'd been sold by their leadership bore little resemblance to what had actually been happening. Farage wasn't finished. Having established the pattern of broken promises and documented corruption, he moved to an even more damaging line of attack: Starmer's personal conduct and fitness for leadership. He brought up the confrontation with Tom Hardy, describing how the Prime Minister had responded to legitimate questions about arts funding by threatening and attempting to intimidate a concerned citizen. He contrasted Starmer's public image as a defender of culture and the arts with the reality of how he treated someone who actually cared about those issues enough to ask difficult questions. Farage pointed out that this wasn't how secure, competent leaders behave. Confident leaders welcome scrutiny because they have nothing to hide. They engage with criticism because they believe in their positions and their policies. They treat questioners with respect because they understand that in a democracy, leaders serve the people, not the other way around. Starmer's response to Hardie revealed someone who viewed questions as attacks and accountability as insubordination, and that attitude, Farage argued, explains so much about how this government operated and why it was failing so spectacularly. He then brought up the PMQ's incident where the Speaker had to publicly reprimand Starmer for breaking parliamentary rules and attacking an MP who'd asked about consultant spending. Farage noted the irony that the very issue that caused Starmer to lose control was exactly the issue he'd just spent 20 minutes documenting in detail. The Prime Minister's meltdown hadn't been about an unfair or misleading question. It had been about a question that exposed something he desperately wanted to keep hidden. And when that exposure happened, he responded not with transparency or explanation, but with aggression and rule breaking that required the Speaker's intervention. Farage painted a picture of a Prime Minister who was increasingly isolated, surrounded only by people who told him what he wanted to hear, incapable of handling criticism or acknowledging mistakes. He suggested that this wasn't just a personality flaw, rather it was a fundamental disqualification for leadership, especially during challenging times when Britain needed someone who could make difficult decisions, admit when things weren't working, and change course based on evidence rather than ego. The Labour benches were notably quiet now. The shouting and protests had stopped. MPs were looking at each other, at their leaders, at the doors, anywhere except at Farage, as he continued his systematic dismantling of their Prime Minister's credibility. And then came the moment that would define this entire confrontation. Farage paused, looked directly at Starmer, and said that he understood why the Prime Minister responded so poorly to scrutiny and accountability. It was because Starmer knew, as everyone in that chamber knew, that his government was built on lies. Lies about what they would do in office, lies about how they would govern, lies about their priorities and their values. And now that those lies were being exposed one by one, the only response he had left was to attack the people exposing them, because he certainly couldn't defend the indefensible reality of his actual record. The silence in the chamber was absolute. This wasn't the usual parliamentary rhetoric where everyone accuses everyone else of dishonesty in vague terms. This was a specific, direct accusation, backed by extensive evidence that had just been presented. Starmer should have responded, should have defended himself, should have refuted the claims if they were false. But he sat there, his face flushed, his jaw tight, saying nothing while his entire government was accused of systematic dishonesty in the most formal setting of British democracy. And then it happened. One Labour MP in the back benches stood up and walked toward the exit, then another, then several more within seconds. A stream of Labour MPs was heading for the doors, walking out of the chamber while Farage was still speaking. Some looked angry, some looked embarrassed. But all of them were leaving rather than sitting there and listening to the truth about what their party had become. The opposition benches erupted in jeers and shouts. The Speaker called for order but didn't try to stop the MPs from leaving, perhaps recognising that they had the right to exit, even if doing so made them look guilty and cowardly. Farage paused his speech to watch them go, a slight smile on his face. And then he said something that would be quoted in every newspaper and news broadcast for days. And there they go, fleeing from the truth because they lack the courage to face it. They can leave this chamber, but they cannot escape the reality of what they've done to this country and to the people who trusted them. The remaining Labour MPs looked stricken. Those who had stayed were trapped between loyalty to their party and the humiliation of watching their colleagues abandon the chamber. Starmer sat frozen in his seat, unable to leave himself because that would be even more devastating, but also unable to effectively respond to what was happening. His entire government was collapsing in credibility in real time, broadcast live to the nation, and there was nothing he could do to stop it or minimise the damage. Farage continued speaking for another few minutes, but the walkout had become the story. He wrapped up by saying that the British people deserve better than leaders who lied to them, who wasted their money on cronies and consultants, who responded to accountability with aggression and intimidation, and who literally ran away rather than face the consequences of their actions. He called for a vote of no confidence in the government and demanded a full independent investigation into the consultant contracts and other spending irregularities he documented. He finished by noting that while Labour MPs could walk out of the chamber, they would eventually have to face voters who would remember this moment and would judge them accordingly. The opposition benches erupted in applause while the depleted Labour benches sat in miserable silence. Starmer eventually rose to respond, but his rebuttal was weak and defensive. He tried to dismiss Farage's speech as political theatre and conspiracy theories, but that argument was impossible to sustain when everything had been documented with official sources. He attempted to attack Farage's credibility and motives, but that only made him look more desperate and only reminded everyone that his response to criticism was always to attack the messenger rather than address the message. He claimed that the MPs who walked out had done so because Farage was wasting Parliament's time with baseless accusations, but nobody believed that explanation when those same MPs had been sitting through far less consequential debates without feeling the need to leave. The damage was done and everyone in that chamber knew it. Starmer had been exposed, his government had been revealed as corrupt and dishonest, and his own party members had fled rather than defend him, making them look complicit in everything Farage had detailed. The aftermath of the confrontation was immediate and catastrophic for Starmer's government. Video of the walkout went viral within minutes, viewed millions of times across every platform. The image of Labour MPs fleeing the chamber while Farage spoke became an instant symbol of a government that couldn't defend its record and wouldn't face accountability. News outlets that had previously given Starmer relatively favourable coverage couldn't ignore or downplay what had happened because it was too dramatic and too significant. Headlines screamed about the parliamentary crisis and the government in chaos. Political analysts scrambled to assess the damage and to predict what would come next. The consensus was nearly unanimous. This was a defining moment that would hang over the Starmer's government for as long as it lasted, which many predicted wouldn't be much longer. Opposition parties were jubilant, calling emergency press conferences to pile on additional criticism and to demand Starmer's resignation. They filed formal complaints about the walkout, arguing that MPs who abandoned the chamber during important debate had violated their obligations to their constituents. They renewed calls for investigations into all the issues Farage had raised, knowing that the public attention generated by the confrontation made it much harder for those investigations to be blocked or buried. Most importantly, they recognised that the reaction within the Labour Party was even more significant than the external criticism. MPs who had walked out faced fury from their constituents, who flooded their offices with calls and emails demanding explanations for why they'd abandoned their posts rather than defending the government's record. Those who had stayed faced different but equally angry questions about why they were still supporting a Prime Minister who had been so thoroughly discredited. Party activists who had campaigned enthusiastically just months earlier were openly questioning whether they'd been lied to about what Starmer actually stood for and what kind of government he intended to run. To done something they'd been unable to do. He'd broken through the public's cynicism and apathy by presenting the case against Starmer in such a clear, compelling and well-documented way that even people who didn't normally follow politics were paying attention and demanding answers.